Ever since Elemental came out, many have drawn comparisons between it and Disney's 2016 effort Zootopia, mainly because both involve fictional worlds where different species are used as a metaphor for diverse groups of people in real life, with that being animals and elements respectively. However, when one really takes a closer look, these movies don't have too much in common beyond that, telling two completely different stories centered around very different characters. And today, I'd like to compare and contrast both these movies and see how many similarities they really have. And obviously there will be spoilers for Elemental and Zootopia ahead, so in case you haven't seen either of them yet but would like to, you probably shouldn't proceed with this video. You have been warned. Okay, so to address the elephant in the room first, and no, I'm not talking about Francine here, the extremely anti-racist message that both these movies contain is the biggest reason the two are often compared to each other. But even then, it wasn't presented exactly the same way, because Elemental was based around director Peter Sohn's Korean parents immigrating to New York City and the many obstacles they faced. So as a result, the movie is more tailor-made to focus on that, with such things as Bernie and Cinder having to get more pronounceable names, the blue flame that's so important to their culture, and the fire elements facing discrimination for being thought of as dangerous, while on the flip side, Zootopia is a much more generalized allegory, with the filmmakers even stating that they didn't want the predators and prey to represent any one group of people and can instead be allegories for whoever the audience wants them to be. And that was honestly the best decision they could have made, as it allows the film to be a much more universal and applicable to any anti-discrimination movement and shows that prejudice is wrong no matter who it's being targeted at. Now, this isn't to say that Elemental doesn't also do a good job at conveying the pitfalls and societal injustices against specific groups of people. It's just that because it's more personalized, it'll end up saying and meaning more to certain people over others. Because as I noted in my video on Sausage Party of all things, which you can find a link in the description to, an allegory in a story best works when what's being used to represent something can directly translate into how that thing works in real life. And while both movies succeed in that task, Zootopia does it on a much broader scale and thus is able to speak to more people. But to give credit where it's due, one thing that's present in both movies is the lesson that being discriminated against is no excuse to discriminate against others in turn, as characters in both movies end up doing this either knowingly or unknowingly, and it only leads to even more problems for them without solving anything. But once again, other than that, the two films don't really have anything in common aside from the two leads being a male and female of different backgrounds who end up becoming friends. Other than that, they tell completely different stories, because Elemental is ultimately a romantic comedy drama about two seemingly unmatchable people finding love and whether or not they can persevere in spite of societal pressure and their own biology, while Zootopia is a buddy cop mystery film with no romance to speak of, which is kind of ironic in a way, as many would say that Judy and Nick may just be the best couple to come out of Disney in the late 2010s and 2020s, but going strictly by what's established in the movie, they aren't love interests, just friends with great chemistry. And once again, since the starting point for both these movies is so different, it only makes sense that their plots would quickly veer off in different directions. Because, to elaborate, Zootopia focuses on a rabbit and fox trying to solve a mystery in a system that is ultimately stacked against them, and how it's only by confronting prejudice, rather than embracing or hiding from it, that the world is going to get better. And sprinkled in with all of this is plenty of buddy cop style comedy and shenanigans, all around making for a pretty effective mystery with something important to say when all is said and done. While Elemental, on the other hand, puts the romance front and center, and pretty much everything in the movie is based around that, with the prejudice the characters face and their internal problems either being secondary or the direct result of it. So as a result, the dynamic and chemistry between the characters is a lot more intense, as it derives much of its drama on whether or not they have a chance together, or if their love affair is doomed from the start. But that being said, there is one other surprising aspect that both these movies have in common, which is that they're both arguably too mature for children. Now don't get me wrong here, Zootopia does have plenty of moments for the kids and the moral is geared towards them, but one could argue that it's a little too heavy-handed, because let's face it, this movie does go to some pretty dark places and goes out of its way to portray Zootopia as true to real life as possible, and especially for younger children that can just be a little too much for them. Is it a message worth sending to kids? Absolutely. But maybe it should have been a little more toned down for the final product, especially because this is supposed to be a Disney movie after all. Now, if you disagree with me on that, that is totally fine. But it does still feel like it's catering a bit more to the adults watching, as I've explained in countless other videos. And as far as Elemental goes, I already went over this in my review of the movie, which you can also find a link in the description too. But the emotional core of Ember and Wade's romance goes so deep that it almost doesn't even feel like a movie made with children in mind, but simply an adult drama that children can watch. Seriously, if the characters were swapped with real people and the animation for live action, it would honestly feel more like a big-budgeted indie romantic dramedy than anything else, which is probably what contributes to people's rather mixed feelings on it, because it feels like Pixar's emotional intensity cranked up to 11, and yet nothing like Pixar at the same time. To put it simply, Elemental doesn't feel like a romance for kids. It's not like Beauty and the Beast, for example, which doesn't insult its audience's intelligence but also goes out of its way to accommodate them, and the results are pretty much universally agreed to be a masterpiece. But Elemental handles things in a much more adult manner, making everything surrounding their love story a lot more intense, to the point that certain things about it might just fly right over the heads of the children watching. And while Zootopia may be heavy-handed, it never really reaches those levels. And not to mention, as I noted in the aforementioned video, the comedy ends up feeling very weird because it almost feels like it belongs in an entirely different film. Obviously some stuff lands pretty well, but other things feel almost bizarre in their inclusion. So while it may be for different reasons, both movies don't really do as good a job as they could have at being children's movies, though they are still suitable enough for them, of course. They just aren't the ideal kids' films. But to get back on track, the point is that Elemental and Zootopia simply aren't anywhere near as uniform as most believe, because like I already said, one is about solving a mystery, while the other is about romance, and with two such different starting points, it's basically a given that they wouldn't heavily resemble each other, apart from taking advantage of their premise to impart an important lesson on the evils of intolerance, bigotry, and societal prejudices. But the stories themselves are totally different, and don't resemble each other beyond that at all. Even if one does view the dynamic between Judy and Nick as a romantic one, it still doesn't really share anything in common with Ember and Wade's romance at all, only reinforcing just how fundamentally different they really are. Though, granted, they do also share a similar visual style, with Zootopia and Elemental City somewhat resembling each other and being very colorful and full of water, so that could be another reason why so many link them together. But just because movies look similar, that doesn't mean they always are. And this arguably unfair comparison many have made between the two films might even be among the reasons why Elemental didn't do great, because some were quick to write it off as a carbon copy of Zootopia without ever giving it a chance and realizing that apart from the moral and some other superficial similarities, the two are actually completely different. And of course, what probably didn't help even among those who had seen it was that they were probably comparing it to Zootopia before the cameras ever started rolling. And since Zootopia was hailed as one of the best movies Disney released in the 2010s, and maybe even one of the best of the decade in general, those shoes were simply too big for Elemental to fill, especially because it was never trying to be like Zootopia in the first place. Now obviously Zootopia is a better movie than Elemental. Even with the issues I have with it, I'll be the first person to say that. But the point here is that Elemental should have never had that comparison put on its shoulders to begin with, and should be judged simply on its own merits instead. Sure, it was running the risk of being compared to Zootopia by advertising itself the way it did, but this unwanted comparison to a film that it could never hope to live up to couldn't have done it any favors at all. But to be completely fair, that's more speculation than anything else. What is concrete fact, however, is that while they share a common theme and moral, that's really all Zootopia and Elemental share with each other. As I've repeatedly stressed, in almost every other regard the two are completely different, which almost makes one wonder if those who are still making comparisons between them have actually seen both films, because it's blatantly obvious at a glance that they aren't telling remotely similar stories. Now, like I said before, even apart from what I just said, obviously they do have some things in common. But the same can be said for pretty much any two movies. There's always going to be some overlap, especially when they try to send a similar message. But before I ramble on any further, the point is that the one element that caused many to draw comparisons between the two films is ironically about the only thing of substance that they actually have in common at all, because they don't feel even remotely similar beyond that. Okay, I think I've gone on for long enough. So now why don't you tell me? Do you believe that Zootopia and Elemental don't really have that much in common beyond their anti-racist messages? Or do you think they share more similarities than I gave them credit for? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And as I already noted, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You can feel about both these movies and how similar they are any way you'd like, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is totally okay. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.